Hello everyone and welcome to the portion of the endocrine system that will discuss the endocrine organs. So we'll start off with the thyroid gland, and you can see here in this image that the thyroid gland is located inferior to our larynx. So it typically will have two lobes, although sometimes we can find this pyramidal lobe, and it is connected by a median mass called the isthmus. You'll see that in this tissue, it is composed of thyroid follicles that are going to produce a glycoprotein called thyroglobulin. When we combine thyroglobulin with iodine, it is a colloid type substance that is going to fill the lumen, and that's what you see here in the medium colored pink, and this colloid is a precursor of the thyroid hormone. We also have some parafollicular cells that can produce the hormone calcitonin. So here's a nice image that is depicting the follicle cells that will produce the colloid within it. And in between these follicle cells, so there are some good examples over here, a couple over here and over here. In between these follicle cells, we have the parafollicular cells that are going to secrete that calcitonin when necessary. So we have two types of thyroid hormones. We have T4 or thyroxine. This is going to have two tyrosine molecules and can bind 4 iodine atoms. This is why it's called T4, because of the 4 iodine atoms. And we also have T3 or triiodothyronine that is going to have 2 tyrosines and bind 3 iodines. We need iodine within our diet, or else we cannot make these thyroid hormones. So our thyroid hormones will be our major metabolic hormone. In lectures previously, you may have heard me say that the thyroid hormones help set our basal metabolic rate. So anytime we secrete these hormones, we are going to increase the metabolic rate and heat production, which is known as the calorigenic effect. They'll also play roles in maintaining blood pressure, regulation of tissue growth, development of our skeletal and nervous system, and our reproductive capabilities. And here's our schematic of how these hormones communicate with one another. So let's say you're going through hypothermia and other stressors. It is January or February in Chicago, and you're trying to go through the negative temperatures to head over to school. So your hypothalamus will secrete your thyrotropic releasing hormone, and that will then go through this hepatothalamo-hypophyseal portal system over to your anterior pituitary gland, where the thyrotrophs there will secrete the thyroid stimulating hormone. That will enter circulation through the vein and head over to our thyroid gland, which will then secrete T3 and T4 to cause all the effects that we described. Now, if we have enough of T3 and T4, we should have a negative feedback loop that will go back to the anterior pituitary gland to inhibit TSH and over to our hypothalamus to inhibit TRH. Now, to discuss the synthesis of the thyroid hormone, we need to know that it is derived from an iodinated form of thyroglobulin, which is made by the follicle cells that we described. We've already discussed the negative feedback that can take place if we have an increased amount of T4 and T3. But in instances in which we are pregnant or in extreme cold, we can override this negative feedback loop and continue secreting the thyrotropin releasing hormone. Now let's talk about calcitonin a little bit. Remember that they were produced by our parafollicular cells. They are going to serve as an antagonist to the parathyroid hormone. So what their job is basically to keep the calcium within the bones. So I like this chart over here because it summarizes the functions of both the parathyroid hormone and our calcitonin. So let's take a look at calcitonin first, and then we'll revisit the parathyroid hormone. We are at our homeostasis level, but then we have a situation in which we have too high of calcium concentration within our blood, which typically is not going to happen. There has to be some type of major pathology taking place in order for calcitonin to be released. So the thyroid gland then senses this imbalance and will secrete calcitonin, which will go over and inhibit the osteoclasts surrounding the bone matrix. With that taking place, then we can increase calcium deposit in our bones. The other thing that's going to take place is within our intestines and our kidney, we can decrease the amount of calcium ion uptake and reabsorption. And what that in turn will cause is calcium levels will fall and go back to homeostasis. Now, what did that parathyroid hormone do again? It was released by these parathyroid glands posterior to our thyroid gland. And when we have our calcium concentration within our blood decrease below homeostasis levels, then we are going to activate those osteoclasts, resorbing the bone and releasing the calcium into circulation. Within our intestines, we are going to increase the uptake or reabsorption into our circulation. And in our kidneys, we will do the same. Increase calcium reabsorption from the tubules back into our bloodstream. And that will cause the calcium levels to rise and go back to homeostasis. You may have remembered from a previous screencast that this is familiar to that humoral secretion of hormones. That is how calcitonin is going to regulate the calcium level here, is through that humoral secretion. So typically this isn't too important within humans because, like I said, we don't have too many instances in which we are going to get too much calcium within our blood. So if you remove the thyroid and the parafollicular cells, then it's not really going to affect calcium homeostasis. And this is just another chart here that is giving you the rundown of how calcitonin is going to stimulate calcium uptake back into our blood and put it into our bones. So let's talk about that parathyroid gland just a little bit more. We will once again find them posterior to our thyroid gland, and we will find typically 4, but it can be up to 8 of these little glands. If we look at their histology, we can see that there are 2 major types of cells here. We have these oxyphil cells, and we're not really sure what the function of these cells are. More importantly, though, we have these chief cells that are going to secrete the parathyroid hormone. And these cells are very important because they are secreting the most important hormone, the parathyroid hormone, in calcium concentration homeostasis within our blood. So what does our parathyroid hormone do? Just as a review, it is going to stimulate our osteoclasts to digest the bone matrix. It'll enhance reabsorption of calcium and secretion of phosphate by our kidneys, and it will promote activation of vitamin D by our kidneys and increase absorption of calcium by our intestinal mucosa. And we can use our negative feedback control. When we see a rise within blood calcium levels, we can inhibit the parathyroid hormone release. Let's jump into our adrenal glands, also known as our suprarenal glands. We will find these atop the kidneys, and they are paired pyramid-shaped glands. Structurally and functionally, these are going to be made up as 2 glands in one. So if we look at the image inferiorly, at the bottom of the page, we could see the periphery is made up of the adrenal cortex. In here, we will have 3 different layers of glandular tissue that will synthesize and secrete corticosteroids. And within our medulla, the inner portion here, we are going to have nervous tissue that will serve as a part of the sympathetic nervous system. So let's take a look at those 3 layers in the adrenal cortex. I apologize, this image turned out a little blurry, but let's describe the 3 different layers. First, we have the zona glomerulosa, and that is going to be the most external layer in the cortex and is in charge of synthesizing and secreting mineralocorticoids. The middle layer will be the zona fasciculata, and that will be in charge of secreting the glucocorticoids. And lastly, the innermost layer is our zona reticularis, and that is in charge of secreting our gonadocorticoids, also known as the sex hormones. Here is a much clearer picture of those layers. We do have a capsule that covers the adrenal glands, and that kind of helps to support and protect these tissues. The most external was the zona glomerulosa. Then we have the zona fasciculata, and lastly the zona reticularis. Below that region, remember, we have the adrenal medulla that contains nervous tissue from the sympathetic nervous system. Now let's discuss those different corticosteroids a little bit more in detail. First, we have our mineralocorticoids, and they will work to regulate our electrolytes, typically more of sodium and potassium within the extracellular fluid. The reason sodium is so important is because it's going to affect the extracellular fluid volume, our blood volume, blood pressure, and the levels of other ions. And the importance of our potassium is that it is going to set the resting membrane potential of our cells. And we have discussed this within the cardiovascular system, but we will further discuss it once we get into the muscular system as well. One of the main mineralocorticoids that we secrete is aldosterone. This is the most potent type of mineralocorticoid that we can have, and it helps to regulate the electrolyte concentrations in extracellular fluids like we mentioned before. And we've already discussed that aldosterone really helps with sodium reabsorption, and wherever sodium goes, water wants to follow. So it also works in water retention within the kidneys. Here's a nice image that depicts some of the functioning of the adrenal gland. We can first let's look at the short-term stress response. We have in our hypothalamus a preganglionic neuron that sends an impulse. This is a motor neuron, by the way, that sends an impulse over to our spinal cord, where we will have some cell bodies located, but it'll go through the spinal cord and continue on down over to the adrenal medulla. Once it synapses within the adrenal medulla, it is going to allow epinephrine and norepinephrine to enter circulation. So what happens when they enter circulation? We will have our heartbeat and blood pressure increase, blood glucose levels will also rise, and our muscles will become energized. Now let's take a look at the long-term stress response. When we are stressed for a prolonged period of time, months, years, we are going to have our glucocorticoids secreted from the adrenal cortex. So let's go through this pathway. We have neurons within the hypothalamus that will send a signal down through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, and then that continues to the anterior pituitary gland and will secrete ACTH to head over to the adrenal cortex. From there, we will release the glucocorticoids and the mineralocorticoids. So what are the glucocorticoids in charge of? They will assist in protein and fat metabolism instead of carbohydrate breakdown. They will also reduce inflammation and our immune cells will be suppressed. Our mineralocorticoids are going to reabsorb sodium and water. That was the function of aldosterone. And by doing this, we are going to increase blood volume and blood pressure. So let's look at that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. We discussed this within our respiratory system, so let's run through it again. This mechanism is going to be stimulated when we have a decrease in blood pressure. The kidneys are going to secrete renin, which will trigger the formation of angiotensin II, and it does this by taking angiotensinogen, converting it to angiotensin I, gaining ACE, the angiotensin converting enzyme from the respiratory system, over to the angiotensin II molecule. And that will mainly cause the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, which will cause sodium and water reabsorption. If we take a look at the concentration of potassium, we are going to stimulate the release of aldosterone if we have increased levels of potassium, and that will influence the zona glomerulosa cells within the cortex. When we release ACTH, that is only going to cause small increases of aldosterone during stress. Now we know that antagonistic to aldosterone is the atrial natriuretic peptide, and that is secreted by the atrial wall of the heart and will decrease blood pressure. Here's another great figure depicting the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. This is just showing how we have some stress that can secrete ACTH that will cause small releases of aldosterone, and it also shows us that the increase in potassium would cause the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone as well. And if you want to go back, you can always follow the full renin pathway too. So here's increased renin causing angiotensin I to then turn into angiotensin II, which goes over to our adrenal cortex, releasing aldosterone. And here are the actions of aldosterone. The other thing that aldosterone does is causes vasoconstriction of the arterioles, and we could see that at the number 15, which increases blood pressure until it returns to normal. And one more figure. This one incorporates the atrial natriuretic peptide that is released when we have increased blood pressure or blood volume, and it will have an inhibitory effect on this zona glomerulosa, inhibiting aldosterone from being secreted. Now let's discuss the glucocorticoids, or the main one that we know as cortisol. It's going to work to keep our blood sugars relatively constant, maintain our blood pressure by increasing the action of vasoconstrictors, and it is going to be released in response to ACTH, which we already know. And patterns of eating and activity and stress can trigger ACTH to be released. So you could see some of the pathways that cortisol will take, targeting our adipose tissue and triglycerides, which will then catabolize them into free fatty acids, which increases the amount of free fatty acids we have within our blood. They can also take this pathway, creating increased ketone bodies in our liver, or released from our liver. The other thing it could do is directly go to the liver and release ketone bodies, and through the pyruvic acid, secrete increased glucose within our blood. And lastly, it can head over to our muscles, using the protein there to break it down and gain increased amino acids within our blood. Now let's quickly discuss our gonadocorticoids, or the sex hormones. Most are going to be androgens, also known as the male sex hormones, that will be converted to testosterone in tissue cells, or estrogens within females. We know these as steroid-based hormones or lipid hormones. They are going to contribute to the onset of puberty, the appearance of secondary sex characteristics, and sex drive. When we look at the histology of the adrenal medulla, we can see that there are these cells called chromaffin cells that will secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine makes up about 80% of the secretion, whereas norepinephrine makes up 20% of the secretion. These hormones will cause the blood glucose levels to rise, blood vessels to constrict, the heart to beat faster, and blood to be diverted over to our brain, heart, and skeletal muscle. So basically all of the things that you would want to take place during a fight or flight response. Epinephrine is going to stimulate any of our metabolic activities, bronchial dilation, and blood flow to our skeletal muscles and heart. Our norepinephrine will influence our peripheral vasoconstriction and blood pressure. Now for our pancreas. This will be our triangular gland that sits posterior to the stomach, and you could see that the head is cradled by the duodenum. Its body will transverse the vertebrae, and its tail will point to the spleen that would be located right over here. So the stomach in this image is missing. Our pancreas is very unique in that it is both an exocrine and endocrine gland. Even though it has more exocrine tissue than endocrine tissue, its endocrine functions are vital. In the pancreas, we have acinar cells. This has an exocrine function and will secrete the enzyme-rich juice for digestion that will be secreted into the duodenum that we learned within the digestive system. When we take a look at our pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans cells, we will see that we have more of an endocrine function. At the central portion of this pancreatic islet, we will see alpha cells, which are depicted by the dark navy blue, and these cells are important in producing glucagon, which is also known as the hyperglycemic hormone. They will function to allow glucose to stay within our blood. Our beta cells, which you see in the lighter teal blue, will produce insulin, and this is known as the hypoglycemic hormone. Insulin will work to take glucose from our blood and put it into our cells. Here is a histologic image of what this looks like in actuality. So here are the alpha cells that produce glucagon, and in the blue, the lighter blue, we have our beta cells that secrete the insulin that would put the glucose into our cells. And we can see those pancreatic acinar cells here that have the exocrine functioning. A bit more on glucagon here. The major target for glucagon is the liver, where it will promote two major processes. We have glycogenolysis, which will break down glycogen into glucose, which will then move into our blood. And we also have gluconeogenesis, which will take substances that we typically wouldn't use to create glucose, so something like amino acids, and create glucose and then secrete it into our blood, so that in the end we have increased blood sugar or glucose. For our effects of insulin, we know that its function is to take glucose from our blood and put it into our cells. So by doing that, we are going to decrease our blood glucose levels. It will also enhance membrane transport of glucose into fat and into our muscles. So you could see this glucose moving into our muscle fibers, and it will also participate in neuronal development and learning and memory. It will inhibit those processes we just discussed that glucagon promotes, that being inhibition of glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Here are the hormones of our reproductive system that we will first cover in the female, in the ovaries, and the placenta. We know that the gonads will produce steroid sex hormones. Our ovaries within females will produce estrogens and progesterones. They together will be responsible for the maturation of our female reproductive organs, the appearance of female secondary sexual characteristics, breast development, and cyclic changes within the uterine mucosa. When the placenta is present in a pregnant woman, this new organ that our body has created will secrete its own estrogens, progesterone, and a new hormone called the human chorionic gonadotrophin. It does take 3 months for the placenta to fully develop and secrete HCG. Now for the hormones within the male. The testes will have inside of it interstitial cells that will produce testosterone. You may have also heard of the interstitial cells being called Leydig cells, and that is important because testosterone that they will produce will initiate maturation of the male reproductive organs, can cause appearance of male secondary sexual characteristics and sex drive. It will be necessary for normal sperm production, which I will show you right in this image here. Here are the spermatogonia that first develop, and as they move into the lumen of what we will learn will be the seminiferous tubules within the testes, they will give the appearance of what we know to be mature sperm cells, although they fully haven't matured just yet at this point. So you can see here a cross-section of that seminiferous tubule. The spermatogonia would line the outside here, the periphery of the tubule, and toward the inside, the sperm has gained its tail, and we can now call it spermatozoa. Now for our hormones of the pineal gland, which we find in the brain. So if we're looking at the brain, this here is called the corpus callosum, and toward the posterior end of the corpus callosum, we will have this tiny pineal gland that is hanging from the roof of the third ventricle. So we haven't quite learned what the third ventricle is just yet. Just know that it is a space between the two thalami in our brain that will contain cerebrospinal fluid. In the pineal gland, we will have pinealocytes that will secrete the hormone melatonin. Careful not to mix this up with melanin. Melatonin is derived from serotonin, and its effects will be timing of sexual maturation and puberty, our day and night cycles or circadian rhythms, and our physiological processes that will show rhythmic variations, such as our body temperature, our sleep, and our appetite.